Okay, good evening, everybody. It's Monday night, which means it's Mondays with Maishi time. It's here in Lakewood, New Jersey, 9 o'clock, time to start. We had a couple of weeks breaks to digest some of the information that we had on previously from Dr. Peter Levine and others. Very rich program. And it's time for another very rich program because I'm here tonight with Dr. Chaya Rubin, who is a psychodynamic psychoanalyst out in far away in New York City. I think you have practice in New York, right? In the city and in Brooklyn. Anywhere else besides that?
I'm actually just in Brooklyn. I'm licensed in New Jersey, but my actual physical space is just in Brooklyn at this point.
Okay, cool. So Brooklyn, New York, right? If you know anybody, if you ever heard of it or know anybody there, you get a chance tonight to hear some words, pearls of wisdom from Dr. Chaya Rubin. Um, and of course, tonight's going to, talk about psychoanalysis or psychodynamic work and specifically, hopefully, hone in on the process of insight in psychotherapy, the kind of uh, weeby-jeeby word, insight. And, we're going to find out tonight, hopefully, exactly what insight means, what its value is, and how it actually helps in the therapeutic process. Dr. Chaya, tell us a little bit about who you are, what is your training, what's your background? Just tell us who you are. And thanks for
Thank
coming on and joining us again.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I am a licensed psychologist. As we've already said, I have a private practice and a group practice that I manage with a wonderful team working with me. I see adults and couples and children, as do the associates in my practice. I started out as a teacher, like most Beis Yaakov graduates. Changed careers. I was a college teacher, I got trained as a college teacher, became a college teacher, and then switched course and went back to school, got my doctorate, and became a psychologist. I'm now working not only in private practice, but also I do a lot of supervision. I'm working at Adelphi and supervising doctoral students there as well as in Furkov and running supervision groups, doing all kinds of other things. I'm also an NYU postdoc, which is a formal psychoanalytic training institute
Mm.
for psychoanalysis. So I'm definitely analytically oriented. I think a lot about analytic work. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about insight because we think of psychodynamic psychotherapy as insight oriented. It's often called insight oriented. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So psychodynamic work is known as insight-oriented work. And again, hopefully we'll understand a little bit more tonight why it is that way and what insight does that's helpful for the therapeutic process. Um, Chaya, just tell me for a minute, there's been a trend over the past few decades, to sort of trend away from psychoanalysis, almost as if, like sort of, I think the tone has been that there's faster, effective ways. Kind of, the way I see it is like all the innovators of all these new kinds of modalities were sort of trained in psychoanalytic work and then figured out some express train or maybe identified particular uh, parts or variables of the therapy process that have really been the main crux of what produces change and have sort of innovated all kinds of other um, again, I don't even in all these new modalities, I don't know that so many of them are new creations as much as honing in on particular variables of the psychoanalytic process and saying this is what if we capitalize on this in the therapy room, we can do this faster or we can get the process moving sooner or with less pain or something like that. Can you tell me a little bit, like, what's your philosophy on psychoanalysis? What drew you to it to begin with? And what do you think about some of all these new modalities? And by the way, just a housekeeping piece, please, for those of you who could turn on your videos, we always love to see you. It just makes it more interactive for us. So thank you, Yocheved and Malka and Abigail. And for those of you who could turn it on, we'd love to see you. For those of you who can't, we totally understand. It's late at night. But tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, so you asked a bunch of really good questions. Just to comment, I mean, you keep on using the word psychoanalysis with an inflection on the psycho, and that's not lost on me. So,
Never mind.
um,
Let's just move to the next topic. Okay.
okay. I do think it's an important question because we have to talk about how psychoanalysis lost its shine and why it's no longer in vogue. And I think, if you can do things the fast way or the slow way, most people say, yes, fast way, please.
Mhm,
And I often have people that I meet that I see would do well with a symptom focused treatment.
mhm,
And I think there's nothing wrong, there's nothing to be ashamed of. I actually have tremendous respect for behavioral treatments or cognitive behavioral treatments that work at more solution focused or skills focused. And I think it has its place. And sometimes a very important first line treatment. The people that I work with, the people that are drawn to psychodynamic or psychoanalytic psychotherapy are typically people that have tried those shorter treatments and haven't yet fully been relieved of their symptoms, or they're looking for something more depth oriented. So I definitely think it's not a first line treatment for many people
mhm,
unless you're particularly looking for psychoanalysis
mhm,
because you're drawn to, you're an analytical person and you automatically are oriented to that type of explorative process.
mhm,
Um, how I got to it myself is, I grew up in a house where I was exposed to these ideas. So I kind of absorbed it from a very young age. I can't claim that I arrived at it on my own. I didn't arrive at it on my own, but I definitely was, it's just a kind of thinking and a kind of orientation that I feel is very shockingly so because people think that it's antithetical to religious to orthodox lifestyle, and I find very important overlaps that to me seem very valuable as a way of working.
mhm.
So that's why I practice that
Okay.
way.
Okay. So it's not exclusive, in your lexicon of therapy that this is the only way for a person to be able to be helped.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I do know that, I mean, I know we've discussed this once before. I think it was Rollo May who spoke about the gimmicky therapies.
Mhm,
And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of up and coming. Just when you think you've heard of every single type of therapy, there's another type of therapy that crops up. And I think that is because it's very hard to treat psychological stress. And, unfortunately, there are certain forms of distress that can't be treated, that can't be healed. They can be maintained. And I think the reason why there are so many new up and coming treatments is to address that very painful reality.
yeah. And I wonder very often, there's some of these that become very hot and in vogue for a short period of time, and then they sort of lose their steam. And sometimes I wonder if we might be better off seeing them as part of a toolbox. So in other words, emotional regulation skills, which might get some name, some form of therapy, modality or, named modality, might sometimes be something that can be helpful to be incorporated in the course of greater treatment. That's how I see it. Like somebody maybe identified a way, to help regulate emotions or to help, DBT skills, but that it's not necessarily the end all of the therapeutic treatment. That's, I guess, my little thought on that. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So
Well,
Kyle,
so we don't have any cool like paraphernalia. Like
yeah,
I saw someone walking out of my office who I love her dearly. She had these cool glasses that she uses. Half of it was clear and half of it was black. And I thought, wow, you work with tools. So it's a thing.
okay.
We don't have wands like you know
Like EMDR uses wands.
I don't even know. No magic wands. No nothing. It's
Okay.
just
So
a
we
couch.
have to
That's what we could
after the
do.
show we have to talk a little bit about some marketing swag.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Maybe David
We have
Brandt
no swag.
can help us out with swag. David?
Yes.
No? Okay. Hi, let's talk a little bit about insight, the process and the necessity and the tool of insight in the therapeutic process. I mean, first of all, give me a little bit of an understanding when we talk about insight. What is insight referring to?
Okay, so it refers to the idea that Freud came up with, which we all knew, but he operationalized this idea that we cannot know our own mind. There are parts of ourselves that we don't know. And he called this the unconscious, right? This is a very familiar idea to all of us. And those of us that subscribe to these treatments that believe in an unconscious, that recognize that we just don't know ourselves very well. And there's a reason why we don't know ourselves very well, because if we would know the deep, dark thoughts that we have, we would be horrified. So the idea is that even though we don't know it, it's relegated to the unconscious. There's a part of us somewhere outside of our awareness that does have to contend with these realities, with these realizations. And it creates a tension. And we develop ways of coping with these tensions. And we call these adaptations defense mechanisms. And when the defense mechanisms interfere with our day-to-day functioning, we call them symptoms. So that in a nutshell is the idea of what is the place of the unconscious in a psychological theory. And then following that, the idea that Freud came up with, and I'm saying Freud because he was the first guy to do this. Most people following him used this and piggyback, off this and ran with this idea. And that idea is that if you make the unconscious conscious, if you create awareness or insight, then you can heal the symptoms.
Okay,
And
so
that
let's
is, in a very, very simplistic form, the basis of a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic treatment.
excellent. So you really wrapped it up in the most precise form that you could. So you said it all in like a minute or two. But let me see if I could unpack that a little bit. And I want to, sort of paraphrase what I'm hearing you saying. You let me know if I'm getting this right. What I think I'm hearing you say is that the unconscious knowledge that we have about ourselves can't be in our conscious mind all the time because it's so complicated and disturbing. For instance, if we have negative thoughts, if we have thoughts of death, if we have negative behaviors that we do that we struggle with, et cetera, et cetera. If we were to have to contend with this all the time in our conscious mind, we wouldn't be able to function. So we repress them, we hide them, we forget about them, we push them aside. Okay, and then we don't have to deal with them and contend with them all the time. However, we still actually know somewhere within us that they exist. And because we do, they do end up creating some levels of conflicts. So for instance, if you look at just, the id versus the superego, right? So a person will have needs, desires, wants, likes, and then at the same time believe that many of them are inappropriate, are wrong, are bad, let's just call it for simplicity's sake. And they're sort of constantly contending with that, right?
Mhm.
And so we push them to the side, but we still know that we want them. So I might want to do something or feel like I need to do something that's against my conscience, right? That goes against my values. I feel like I need to or want to do it. I push it to the side, and then I somehow have to contend or deal with that. And so what I do is I develop some level of adaptation, a defense mechanism to make believe or somehow protect myself or prevent myself from doing it. Well, you
Mhm.
use the word denial, right? So I'll deny that I need it. So like an example I like to give is a guy likes to have a nice car, but he can't afford it. So his neighbor gets a nice car, or a guy likes to have a nice car, but when he was growing up, he was told that nice things are stupid and vain. So his neighbor gets a nice car, and he turns to his wife and kids and says, "We don't need to drive such a fancy car. It's stupid. There's no point to it." Now, really, what's happening is that he's struggling with his id and his superego, right? His id is saying, "Ooh, that's a nice car. I want that," right? And his superego is telling him that's a bad value. And so he uses a defense mechanism of denial to say, we don't need these things. We don't like them. They're against our values. They're stupid. They're pointless. We just need wheels to get us from place to place. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then
Mhm.
now by somehow entering our unconscious or bringing our unconscious into our conscious, drawing it out, somehow that's called insight and that's going to help. Now, that
Mhm.
doesn't seem to make much sense to me when I think about it. If I'm going to now recognize and acknowledge or admit that I'm struggling internally, I'm sort of opening up a Pandora's box and a can of worms and making problems for myself. So how would insight actually be helpful in this process?
So I'm gonna I'm gonna put a little bit of a cover on the how, because it's not fully known how that's the case. We just recognize that there is this phenomenon of, because I mean, I guess if you subscribe to this idea that, you know, what's unknown creates tensions and that knowing it releases some of that tensions, then I guess you could say that's the how. Um, but you know, this is not necessarily a science. This is a theory.
Mhm.
So we're operating with this theoretical idea. Um,
Can there be some sense made to it? I mean, is there an explanation, or is the only thing we're looking to do in psychoanalytic work to bring the unconscious into the conscious and then say good night?
well, depending on the orientation, you know, there are some people say it's all in the relationship, and that they don't even. There are psychoanalytic orientations today that don't even think about the unconscious anymore, which is surprising but true. But we're not gonna talk about those heretics today.
So do you want to give a little bit of an example of a client profile, let's just say, that is struggling with something neurotic, right? Some kind of challenge,
Mhm.
has symptoms, and
Mhm.
then something that you may have identified with with your patient that somehow helped reduce the symptoms without even getting them to do something about the symptoms. So classically, I think the general understanding of therapy to the layperson is you go to the therapist and they give you all kinds of ideas that they read in books and went to school for, and they, the patient or the client sort of went to plumbing school, so they never learned it, and so you're going to tell them how to reduce some of the anxiety, some of the conflict, some of the anger. Talk a little bit about that. We're doing something
Well,
else, so give me some kind of profile.
Well, will say this. I'll say most people think that it's the therapist's provision of insight that relieves symptoms. That's the whole idea. And how does the therapist do it? Via interpretation. This is the idea. And the idea is that if you have the right interpretation at the right time, then you can affect a cure. And I want to talk about that because I think the idea of insight being knowing something about ourselves is misleading. I think there's a moment when all of us have had this in private practice, in a clinic, in anywhere that we've seen patients. We've encountered the moment where the patient has said to us, I already know this. Why am I still suffering? Why am I not better? I have the knowledge, I have the insight. And I think this is a very common phenomenon. So I really want to talk about how people understand insight, what I think the idea of insight is, really referencing, and how it links up to listening. Because what I really think what a therapist is doing in terms of providing insight to a patient is creating the possibility for an aha moment so that the patient can arrive at themselves at the insight. It's not something we're giving them. You know what? I discovered this. I discovered this in a very weird way from John Sarno. I was in graduate school. I was pursuing my doctorate, and I had like on and off tremendous bouts of back pain. And my husband said to me, you know, why don't you just go see Dr. Sarno? You're in training, meet him, see what he has to say. So, of course, in preparation for the meeting, I read The Divided Mind, which is like one of his 500 million books that he had on healing psychosomatic illness. And I go to the meeting. It was $1,000, I remember, for the session, which at that time was like 15, 16 years ago, which is a lot of money. And we had this very sweet
Still a lot
conversation.
of money, by the way. Doesn't know.
It was, yeah.
Just saying.
Um, so we had this really sweet conversation, and it ended up just being we were talking about psychoanalysis. And I told him I read all your books and I know all about your theory of psychosomatic medicine and how it's just repressed psychological ideas that people don't want to contend with. And we're sitting and we're talking, and I told him books that interested me and where I trained and what I was doing, and he was telling me at the end of the whole hour meeting, he gave me close to an hour. And the end of the meeting, he said to me, he had prepared, this is what he used to give out to all the people that came to consult with him, a chapter in his book or a chapter that he wrote that was excerpted from some of his books. Read this chapter for 30 days, and then you'll get healed. And I said, he said, it's not good. He goes, he took the paper, he like folded it. He said, this is the protocol. You can read this for 30 days. It's probably not going to help you. And I was like, why? So he said, you already know. I said, but I have this back pain. So he's like, you can try it. And I just left his office and I was like, I had that quintessential moment where the patient arrives at the, but I know it, and why am I suffering? And it's if the knowledge is curative, if we want to say, because that's the whole idea of insight, it's making the unconscious conscious. So if the knowledge is curative, then why does it not cure? So we have to say that it's something else. It's not the knowledge. It's not the insight. It's something that a person arrives at. This is what I think, and this is in my training. I've begun to believe this very strongly. Something that a person arrives at, this aha moment, this epiphany that they arrive at on their own. They become just completely like shaken by it, and in the talking that through, what we call processing. But essentially, it's not the analyst, it's not the therapist that's going to curate this moment of insight. It's something that the patient has to arrive at their own, and we facilitate this
Mhm.
by asking a question, be asking the right question, or by making the right, a lot of times an interpretation is a reflection, something that helps a person think in a way that will get them to say more.
Mhm.
But it's not as if we're sitting there, the arbiter of all knowledge, and we're going to give them this piece of information that's going to heal them, that's going to cure them. It doesn't work that way.
Mhm.
And I think this is the most misunderstood idea in I would say in all of psychotherapy, because I see therapists all the time, operating with this idea that if I give them the interpretation, if I come in and I tell them this thing, it will help them. It will not help them.
Mhm. Yeah, I know my own supervisor, who's a psychoanalyst, always encourages me or discourages me from giving interpretation, my own interpretations. He prefers, he says sometimes there's room for it, there's place for it, but he prefers that I just keep exploring with the client until they come up with it. And I'm not sure, if the reason is because it's much more unadulterated when the client, it's much more precise and unadulterated when the client identifies specifically and precisely what it is versus when I give the interpretation, which is going to miss something because I'm not living the client's experience, or if there's something inherent in the client figuring it out by themselves that's just more potent.
Yes, I think there's something inherent in the client figuring it out themselves. I'll give you just a very, very classic example, and we've all have encountered this. A patient comes late session after session after session. Every single session comes 10 to 15 minutes late. And we as therapists understand this as ambivalence to treatment or fear of intimacy or whatever myriad ways we want to interpret this. And we understand this presentation. Um, Now, if we make the mistake of telling the patient, you keep on coming late because you're afraid of intimacy, the patient's going to be like, I mean, often, not always. Sometimes, if he's heard it before, maybe he'll be open to it. But how many times? What do you mean? There's traffic on the BQE.
Right.
Like, do you know what it's like getting to your office at this time of day? So I think, and go explain to them. They think you're wacko. go explain to them, no, 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 that this repetition has a significance, and there's a meaning to why you're always 10 to
Right.
15 minutes late. And
So
they
the
just
argument,
think,
the client's argument that a cigar is just a cigar is a form of resistance because we're the ones who's pushing the agenda on them.
correct,
It's a form of resistance. And
right.
what would be the alternative?
Well, it's same thing. It's like telling someone there's a meaning in a dream. You can only They can only accept it if they already believe it.
Mhm.
They've already had to be a believer in that idea of the unconscious in order to arrive at that.
So what's the alternative? It's what's always fascinating is that the client never came late to the first session or the second session. It's only later they somehow figured out how to get there on time with the traffic on the BQE. But what's the alternative then, if not offering an interpretation?
So you wait for the moment that they come to it on their own.
Well,
And it doesn't
let's talk about the
happen.
coming late to the session.
We facilitate it, first of all, by being really patient. People always say, why do psychoanalysts use the word patient instead of client? I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we choose this word, patient from the Latin, to suffer. And there's something about admitting I am in suffering. That's part of the curative process. But most of all, that there's a patience in this process that's exhibited by both analyst or therapist and patient. And we're not providing a service like as if it's a client. This is not a service oriented. This is hopefully something more uh, meaningful, I'll say, or more deep. But
Yeah. Okay, so Chaya, but what I'm asking is give me an alternative just so that people get a little bit of insight, quote unquote, into the insight. Give me an alternative of what we would do with a patient who comes late week after week because of the so-called traffic on the BQE. If we're not going to share with them, I'm wondering if you're coming late because the process is difficult for you. How would we begin to explore in some other way?
So I personally probably wouldn't do anything about it. I would wait till other instances of whatever it is that I think is going on is coming up, and help the patient explore that way. But I wouldn't necessarily interpret this behavior before they can come together. Before they can put it together on their own. I think if you put together the pieces in a vague enough way, an interpretation has to be, there's Madeline Barringer has this great paper. It's called, I think, The Mind of the Analyst. I think it's called, maybe not, I don't remember, but she has this, it's a paper about listening. And she says an interpretation is saying something that the patient already knows and you hear it in them, and then you articulate it. They haven't put it into words, but you've heard it. And that's why interpretation is really listening,
Mhm.
and they then can accept it. It's kind of like, I don't know that much. I know you have an interest in paradoxical intention, but the idea is to get the patient to recognize it on their own, and you do it in this kind of reverse way. But you're getting it rather because they don't want to accept what you're telling them. They don't want to accept an interpretation. But if you find this reverse way in, and then they have to arrive at it, they can swallow it then. So it's something like that.
So
But
okay, I'm not 100% sure I'm wrapping my head around what you're saying yet. If do you mean that if the patient would be talking about how his spouse complains that he doesn't value her time, let's say,
mhm.
he comes late. There's this joke going around that when a woman says I'll be ready in 5 minutes and a man says I'll be home in 5 minutes, it's the same 5 minutes, right? So so he brings up, my wife complains that I come late. I say I'm going to come home, and I don't come home, and I come late. Would that be a time to sort of reflect? It's interesting that she says that. I notice that sometimes to our sessions, you also, tardy. Is that what you mean when you say you bring it up, wait for other things, or not necessarily? You wouldn't necessarily bring it up at all.
I might wait for the moment when the patient says something like, um, I don't know why I didn't say hello to this person at the party. I've been interested in making their acquaintance. I'm interested in becoming their friend. What holds me back? Then I would undertake some sort of explorative process. Well, tell me more. I don't know that I would necessarily say, yeah, and you know what? You don't show up on time to sessions. Maybe you want to get to know me and you don't even, I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't do it. But I would somehow allow for the idea of this inhibition of being with people. Let's say, if we want to say that's what it is or whatever it may be, I would somehow allow for that to be opened up. I don't think I would necessarily, depending on the person, but in this phantom case, um, given the nothing that I know, I don't know that I would necessarily directly address it.
Hmm.
Um, I can tell you a little case snippet that I had. It's not a case, it's a dream that I had this past uh, week, I would say. It was a great dream. It's an 8-year-old girl, perfectionist. That's all I'll say. And teacher sends notes home. Girl is an angel. Okay, type of thing. So that's all I'll say. She comes in, had a terrifying dream. The dream was woke the whole family up from the dream. Couldn't fall back asleep. The dream was I owned a gun, and my sister's friend's sister wanted to take the gun from me and kill me. So I was thinking, maybe I'll take the gun and kill her. End of dream. So first of all, you gotta love the dream of an 8-year-old kid, or my sister's friend's sister, and that's how a dream works, right? It's how many degrees of separation could it be? Like I'm asking for a friend, type of thing. This is my sister's friend's sister, so we know right away this is a sibling rivalry dream. I own a gun. My sister wants the gun. She wants to kill me. I decide I'm going to take it and kill her. I mean, there's so much in this dream. And this is a kid who's struggling with perfectionism. So she has, there's so much in just making a decision that's fraught for her, that's conflictual for her. It has to be perfect in order for her to do it. And the dream is interesting because here's an instance, here's a moment, a proof. Oh, she's not perfect. She has these murderous fantasies like everybody else. She's she's not an angel. She's a regular human being. So it's a great, great dream. And there's so many different things a person could do with the dream. I just said, wow, you dreamed up a problem and you dreamed up a great solution. That's all I said. And the point that I was trying to do with that interpretation, it was an interpretation, was find a way to say, it's okay that you had this feeling. But if I would have said that, my sense that this would have been too disturbing to her to say, first of all, this is not a dream about her. It's a dream about some girl whose sister's friend's sister had to go, you know what I'm saying? She's not even owning this for herself yet. But just to be able to talk abstractly with her about it. And, you know, we say we know if the result of an interpretation in what follows the interpretation. So we can't tell if an interpretation is successful until you see what follows it. Sometimes nothing follows it.
What do you mean when you say
Sometimes
follows it?
what happens next? Like if you make an interpretation for just getting back to the patient who's always late, if you make some sort of interpretation and then they start coming on time, or then they start, forget about coming on time, then they start talking about their difficulty with intimacy and how it manifests in all these different places. Oh, that was an effective interpretation. Someone posted a question earlier. I caught this idea of processing. Can I speak more about it? You're right. I think it was David Brownstein. That phrasing of processing is this colloquial phrasing, but really what it means is explore it, unpack it, get the patient to say more about it so that its essence becomes revealed. I was using just this throwaway term, process it, but it wasn't descriptive. So I just wanted to take that opportunity and explain what that is.
Okay, great. I want to just kind of open up the floor if there's anyone who has questions or comments or anything else that's relevant, please just raise your hand by using the reactions tab on the bottom right of the screen. We'd love to hear them. I'd love to take them. I also want to just mention, as I always do, that this show, Mondays with Maishi, is now sponsored by okclarity.com. okclarity.com is a website and a platform that you can, if you know, mental health professionals and people in the helping field, coaches and mental health professionals and psychiatrists and whatnot can sort of advertise themselves on the website on okclarity.com. It's a great platform. I believe Chaya has a profile or had a profile on okclarity.com, and so do I. You can certainly check out mine, and it's a great way to promote yourself and be able to share with people out there what it is that you do so that they can sort of get to know you, and a great way to market yourself so that you don't have to do it yourself. OK Clarity does it for you. So go check it out. I want to take a question or a comment from Malka. Malka, please share with us what you're thinking.
I actually have a question. I share the Mahalach, so I'm very comfortable with what you're saying. But sometimes I supervise at least 12 people now, well, between 10 and 12. And I've asked over the years the same question, which makes perfect sense. And I have an answer that I give. And I'm wondering if it needs updating with someone newer and younger. And the question is,
Are you referring to me or Chaya?
obviously,
I'm newer, but who's younger? Okay.
And the question is, well, we're doing supervision. I'm telling them what they're doing wrong. And then I say we have to strengthen their ego to accomplish X, Y, and Z. Well, how do we do that? And it sounds like such a simple question, but the thrust of what I do, if I had to say what's my plan for a patient, it's to help them mature. I don't tell them how to be, I want them to mature. How do they mature? They're having boundaried egos and to gain insight and process their feelings. That's the way I do it. But to break things down, well, how do I strengthen their ego? I couldn't say my definitions of how to do it, but I would be curious how you would answer that specific question so that I might learn more and be able to tell people I'm supervising beyond what I normally say. So I would be curious what your answer would be.
It's a great question, and nice to meet a like-minded clinician. I'm not sure how I would answer. I'll tell you honestly. I think you're coming more from an ego psychological lens. It sounds like the whole idea of strengthening the ego as a first line. I'm trained more within other schools that don't necessarily privilege that as the first line. Of course, that's a part of the process in terms of fostering a sense of agency or ego strength. But in just thinking along those terms, I guess I would wonder if you have a specific presentation in mind. I mean, if we think of something that just pops up in my mind, if you're talking about a fragile ego that narcissistically organized, the idea is mirroring.
Yes, I mean, right. I'm thinking of many trauma patients who are very dependent, immature, dysfunctional, how to help them with the insight, with the processing, with the goal of getting them to have an ego, a sense of self that functions. To me, the process of questioning someone and to putting their feelings into words, however long that takes, is in and of itself strengthening an ego because you get boundaries when you know who you are. But I'm wondering if I'm old-fashioned doing this for 35, 40 years, I'm wondering if perhaps there's a newer way to frame it that, I mean, if I'm supervising people, I got to be on the cutting edge and know what's going on. And I like to do that. That's why I come here, and I like to listen to what's yet to be learned. You know, I'm not dead yet. So I'm wondering if you have another angle, something that would be elucidating. I'm thrilled to always learn.
Um, I think there are many ways of approaching something like that. Probably what I would do, and this is just coming from a different orientation, is try to, not, I mean, the idea that this person is very dependent and their own sense of self is weak, I would be more concerned about framing things for them. I would stick very closely to their own language, not, let them, mirror them in terms of seeing the things that they can actually accomplish, the things that they can think, rather than tell them, provide them insight based on my own ways of thinking. I would be very careful, to sort of support their own burgeoning self in whatever in however that manifests, rather than provide them much scaffolding, which I know could be controversial because I know that some people might approach it with, yes, provide it with scaffolding.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I almost can hear Sue Johnson when I say, oh, you get nervous doing that. Mm-hmm. And I say, if she ever heard me, she'd probably think I'm mimicking her, but I am, because that's what I would do for someone very often. I don't tell anyone what to do, but I like that idea of just putting it back to them in a kind of a reframing or a I hear you. This situation makes you very tense, and see if they can explore it. Could you tell me more about it?
Or to
So,
find moments where they are finding their sense of agency and pointing that out to them. So, like,
mhm.
kind of even what, in that little case example of the dream, just to be able to say, wow, you've arrived at a solution, to let her see her own strength. A lot of the way I operate is, from that perspective.
So would you go with that girl even at 8 and say, so how did it feel when you shot her?
Probably not.
Mhm.
Just
Okay,
because
just curious.
yeah, she was so distressed over the dream altogether that just saying something like, wow,
Let's say if you picked up on her distress, would you go that angle and say, you seem upset by it? What's upsetting about this?
right, these are all approaches, and I am not saying anything against those approaches. I guess, you know, it depends on one's personal style, how they want to help the person arrive at this insight and this elusive insight.
Mhm.
My own personal style is different, but it's just based on one's own personal style. I don't think there's a right or wrong way.
Okay.
That's the
Well, that's kind of
creativity inherent.
monopolized works.
But Chaya, you're talking about the listening process, and I feel
Mhm.
like there's something that you know or believe about the listening process that will elicit the strongest results. What is your personal style in how you would engage in the most effective listening process? Let's say with that girl.
Well, I'm trying to let her know that I hear what she's saying, in a way that she can tolerate. Like with this particular person, I know there's a certain, she's so anxious and so fragile
Mhm.
in certain ways. So I know I'm careful, not to put her into too much distress.
Mhm.
But I think, when a person feels heard, that's the most empathic, that's empathy in its truest form. Because, a person feels that you've heard their things that them in the deepest, you've heard them in the deepest way, and you've articulated things that they cannot even say themselves. So they are seen in a way that no one sees them. And I mean, that's the truest form of empathy. And if you can do that, it's a very different thing than saying, you're afraid of intimacy. That's why you're coming late to the session. That's a kind of didactic moment. And that's not to say that it isn't useful, but it's a different thing. It's a different technique. There are some people that operate with cognitive reframe, and there is a didactic component to that. You think like this, it's better to think that way. And that's a very effective way of working too, but it's a different thing. And what we're talking about is how to generate insight psychoanalytically, and in a way where the person can accept it and that it can be effective. And I think the best way to do that is when the person comes to it on their own. And that our job is to facilitate opportunities for that to happen.
Beautiful. Chaya, when you spoke about the girl in the dream, you made a comment, and the comment was that the message that you're trying to convey to her, I know that many earlier therapists make the mistake of actually saying this, but I think what's more important is the how the message is conveyed, because we used to say in the old school they used to hit the kid and said, I'm hitting you because I love you, right? And I don't remember getting hit and feeling loved just because the person, even though the person said I love you and that's why I'm hitting you, right? It's the message that's conveyed. This past week I was at the Nefesh conference for mental health professionals, and I attended a session by Dr. Benjamin Tepfer, who was also on the show a couple of times, and he brought out such a poignant point when he played a piece from the movie The Karate Kid. For those of us from the 80s and the 90s, we might remember The Karate Kid, especially the guys, and it's a fascinating lesson, the movie. And the scene was that Mr. Miyagi, who was the sensei, the karate teacher, was teaching this 12-year-old or 13-year-old Daniel, 14-year-old student Daniel, how to engage in the moves of karate. And he used very few words to teach him. He just kept correcting him and showing a lot of confidence and telling him, hold my eye contact. Don't ever let your eyes leave my eyes, because that shows weakness. It was done in a sort of rough around the edges way, but you can feel the care, you can feel the message that was being conveyed, which is, I have confidence in you, you're going to get this, I'm not letting go of you, and I'm still going to be tough with you, right? And so the message of it's okay that you had this feeling that you said to yourself was kind of what you were trying to convey to the girl in the way you communicated, right? Is something that's very valuable. How can we communicate? You're talking about listening, but it's also conveying, and that's part of the listening process. And for those of you who are following this show long enough, or following me long enough, have heard me make this point many times, and I'm curious, Chaya, as to your thought on this. But this also goes back to Malka's question of how do we strengthen egos? I think that the key thing that people are really struggling with is not necessarily the emotion that they're having, so the anger or the anxiety, but it's the conflict that they have in experiencing that emotion. So I'm angry. I get angry. Why do I get angry? What's wrong with me, with the self, that I get angry? I get anxious. What's wrong with that? And that's the kind of thing that people really suffer from deep down inside. Because if we were to say to anybody that they're walking in a dark alley in a dangerous neighborhood and they feel anxious, probably most people can tolerate that and accept that. But when they're having these anxieties or anger or other symptoms that don't seem to be normal, quote unquote, that's really what people are struggling with. And I strongly believe that the idea of self-acceptance, self-compassion, which leads to self-acceptance, is really the greatest component, the most important variable in self-actualization, in ego strengthening. It's the ability of self-acceptance. And I think that a lot of what you're talking to, Chaya, in hearing and listening and understanding and touching things that are very deep within the person really generates or cultivates this deep sense of acceptance or self-acceptance. Because if you could understand me in such a deep way, that means that my experience is so true and makes, has merit, has place on this world. And that means that I have place on this world. So I believe that the key to symptom reduction is really rooted tremendously in self-acceptance. And I think that that explains a lot of why Carl Rogers, who sort of did nothing when you watch him, was so effective, because his clients were sensing that he was right there as deep in their experience as they were. And that just conveyed to them that their experience has to make sense, because if somebody else can feel it and experience it that deeply and get it that deeply, then I'm very acceptable. Thoughts?
I think you said it beautifully. So I agree with you completely.
Anybody else have thoughts on that? I was hoping for some pushback. Hi. Does anybody see this differently, or does anybody have a different conceptualization of how the process works? And I think, again, the studies always show, there's always this pointing to the studies that show that the relationship is the main thing. The relationship is the key variable to how therapy works. And everybody just asks, like, how does that make any sense? How could the relationship, like the fact that we have a close relationship, does that heal you? And I think the answer is yes. The fact that we have a close relationship is reflective of what's going on. It's not the relationship that heals you, but it's a reflection of the experience that you're having vis-a-vis our relationship that really heals and cultivates that self-acceptance.
Right. I also think, the idea of the relationship being curative is so reflective of the move we've shifted towards in our postmodern world. It's such a postmodern egalitarian approach. I mean, the authoritative approach where, the authoritarian approach where, the therapist is the one who knows everything and is the all-knowing and is silent and the patient just is waiting for this brilliant interpretation. That's the character of psychoanalysis, and we've moved away from that for many reasons, and I would say mostly because we're in a different it's the landscape is different today. The culture is different, so it's a postmodern world, and that dynamic is not effective anymore today. Mm-hmm. So I think we respond to with a treatment that builds on this interactive relational approach, and mm-hmm. it makes sense given just where we are in the world, philosophically.
Yeah, and I could see a correlation, in my own clientele. I could see a correlation of clients who inform me that they're doing better and more of a sense of cohesiveness in our relationship. Okay, so mm-hmm. and I think it's the fact that we worked that relationship so delicately, and that they can feel safer within themselves and more comfortable within themselves, more accepting of themselves, that actually enables them to now go out in the world and be comfortable. And that's why their symptoms are being reduced, because if I struggled that much with having anxiety, I now become more comfortable with having anxiety, and it's not so upsetting anymore. I'm not so neurotic about it. There's this story joke going around from Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson about the guy who goes to the bar. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the story, but it's a great. He's, I think, saying this, in satire, and I think it's quite accurate in his interpretation, in his understanding of therapy. But the story is that this fellow comes to the bar, and he orders a drink, and the bartender serves him the drink, and he picks up the drink, it's about to drink it, and takes the glass and suddenly throws it at the bartender, hits him in the face. The guy's shocked, and he's like, well, he says, I'm so sorry. I'm so embarrassed. I had a really, really difficult childhood. My mother was so abusive. I feel terrible, etc. Comes back the next night and he hands him a drink and he picks up the drink to drink it. And again, he tosses it at the bartender and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so embarrassed. I can't believe that I just did this. I was bullied terribly as a kid and I have so much rage." And the same thing happens the third night. And the bartender says to him, he says, "Look," he says, "I'd love to have you continue coming here, but I have a gash on my face and a bruise on my forehead." He says, I want you to go to therapy for a year, go to psychoanalysis, go to therapy for a year. After a year, come back and I'll be happy to serve you again. But please don't come in here if you come in, I'm gonna have to call the cops. So the guy agrees. The drink is really important to him and the bar is important. He agrees and he disappears for a year. He comes back a year later and he says, "Oh, it's so nice to see you. What can I get you?" And he orders his drink and he pours in the drink. He takes it, he picks up his glass and throws it at the bartender again. Hits him in the face again, new gash. The other one finally healed and he's got a new gash. And he says, "I don't understand." He says, "Didn't we discuss that you're going to go to therapy for a year and work this through? And what happened?" Now you come back and throw it back. He says, "I did go to therapy." He says, "So what happened? What's going on?" He says, "Well, now I'm not embarrassed anymore." Right. So, the idea and I think it really does talk to psychotherapy, that what we're doing is so much of that guilt and shame, really shame is the proper word, that we experience within ourselves, that disables us in so many areas and creates so many different kinds of symptoms. When we become, I'm not ashamed anymore, right? When we become more accepting of ourselves, many of those just dissolve on their own.
Right. And just to your joke, I think Jonathan Shedler has
This
this
better this
idea.
better be a good counter.
Oh my gosh. Wow, now I just forgot what I was going to say. Oh
Jonathan
my goodness.
Shedler.
um, okay, it'll come back to me.
You were saying something about Jonathan Shedler?
It's a good thing I don't have a theory about the meaning of forgetting, because that would be terrible.
If anybody does, please raise your hand. Okay,
Yes.
Malka, go ahead. Let's get Malka back on. Let's see how many seconds it will
Yeah,
take.
what I was going to say is that the example you gave of someone who's very angry, and unless my mind went off to phone calls that were trying me while I was trying to listen, it sounded as if you wanted to push, just accept yourself. This is the way we are. We have to accept ourselves. You really do run the risk of helping a narcissist stay obnoxious and not gain any awareness. So if someone came to me and came to talk about the rage, I would not go to, listen, that's just the way you are. I would truly put in a lot of effort to notice the narcissism and to not try to trigger any defenses. But my goal would be for them to understand, and I would probably say it once I had a good established engagement. Often, anger is the cover up for pain. Would you be ready to talk about yet the pain that's beneath that anger? That was how I would handle it. And someone could say to me, "Nope, I'm not ready. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not pushing it." But I would go back to pushing behavior that's inappropriate, that I know they have their defenses up around it, not to neutralize it and accept it so fast. I do that kind of b'derech agav with, "Hey, so welcome to the human race. Don't we all have mishigasan? Would you like to examine yours a little more, or you want to just stay with it?" I pose it as a question I like to give clarity on a spin so someone could either catch it and go further with it or let it go over their heads because they don't want to face it. That's just what I do.
Mm-hmm. I have a feeling that Chaya would be more passive in that process and not be as direct. And
Yeah,
I also want to.
I've been accused of being direct,
Yeah,
but it's done
but
very
Chaya pointed out
intentionally.
that that's stylistic. That's the
Yeah,
people.
I think it's stylistic,
Style.
right?
It's my personality, but it's very intentional.
Yeah.
And it's only for those who I think can handle it. And it's not for my sake, it's for the purpose of further insight and awareness that I hope will lead to behavioral changes once they process their feelings and they feel that I'm with them. I tell them I'm malaving you through your process. You are not alone. And that helps for them to hear that they're not alone. I'm with them. They have to do their work. I'll ask the questions that help them get there.
Mhm, mhm. And I'm not sure that you're saying something that's different than what I'm saying, or if that was your intention. But again, when we cultivate self-acceptance, the paradox is that the narcissist's defenses will begin to lower somewhat because they're not accepting that they're a narcissist. They're accepting the pain that they're struggling with. They're accepting the wounds that they experienced and acknowledging and accepting that it's not their fault. And that,
That, that to me, it could be just paraphrasing. That would definitely be my goal to help a narcissist realize this is a long time problem and it probably wasn't your fault. Let's look at it together.
Mhm, mhm. Okay. Any other questions or comments on this segment? David, welcome. I don't know if you've been here before, but I hope you
Can you hear me
have.
okay?
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's hear.
I've been here
I just want to
before.
say that David always has insightful things to write and to say, so I think this is the first time you're actually engaging live, if I'm not mistaken.
It may be. I've attended some, but I see clients generally on Monday to until 6:15, which I'm on the West Coast, so I it overlaps and I miss it. But I'm not working today, so it worked out.
Awesome.
And I was very interested in your featured speaker as well. The only real comment that I wanted to make, yes, you mentioned about pushback or if anyone conceptualizes this differently. I think I find it fascinating that there. I think there really is no way from a scientific standpoint to understand what truly is at the heart of what makes change happen. We have theories galore and we have intuitions. Perhaps they're correct, but it's virtually impossible to really get at the heart of the matter because we don't know. We could so I guess my thought, it was just interesting to listen to the conversation and hear inferred within what you were saying and what Chaya was saying and that the ideas of what we think accounts for the changes that we see in our clients. But I think we have good reason to believe that some element of that insight process is a part of it. And I think you commented about the relationship, and I identify very strongly with that philosophy that's curative, at least to a substantial part. But again, even that's an unconscious psychodynamic process that's happening when we're connecting with a client on a very humanistic level. And I guess the only other thing I wanted to throw out there and comment on, and those who know me know that I have an interest in common factors. And what's most interesting to me about the common factor literature is that let's say, and I can't remember the breakdown off the top of my head right now, but a very large and substantial part of what seems to account for change are things that are outside of the therapy and the therapeutic process. Factors of a person's life, whether it's their economic status or their family makeup and so forth. And so, I think to me, it's very humbling to keep in mind that notwithstanding the tremendous impact that we have and the very real effects that, or let's say, the very real portion of the variance that we as therapists, account for and play a part in the changes, the progression, and the improvements in the health of our clients. There's so much more that is not related to us, and that's not from things that we're giving, insights that we're offering, skills that we're teaching, or whatever the case may be. So again, just in response to your request for a little bit of a pushback or a different take on things, I want to bring light to those aspects. And thank you. It was great conversation tonight.
I like that point. Just to comment, there's a great book that was written a while ago, I think in the 70s. It's called Witch Doctors and Psychiatrists by E. Fuller Torrey. And he makes this comparison between the effectiveness of witch doctors as well as psychiatrists, and how different cultures anoint different people to be the healers, and it's a cultural construction. So the construction of healing in our culture is psychotherapy. But it's not to say, I certainly agree with that whole approach of common factors, and the idea that it's the treatment of our time, that that's just is what it is.
Okay. Well, thank you, David. Anybody else have any questions or comments to share? Okay. I want to ask you one last question. Again, if anybody has questions or comments, by all means, raise your hand. But is there something that you are razor focused on in a therapy session? In other words, by me, I find, that oftentimes it's working the relationship, having the client feel accepted, having the client be challenged while being accepted. More narcissistic or sensitive people are going to have a hard time being challenged, or certain, when I do certain observations, they'll have a hard time with it, and being able to balance, how can I observe something about them? I sometimes use some here and now work. So how would I observe something about them and work that relationship? So they may feel a little hurt, offended, defensive, and still work the relationship. So really working the relationship is sort of my focus, and most with most of my clients. Is there something specific that you're razor focused on throughout the progression of sessions?
Yes, I am razor focused on listening as though I know nothing. There's a French psychoanalyst, no longer alive, but quite influenced by his work. His name is Jacques Lacan, and many may have heard of him. And one of the many things that I think were very helpful in my own training is this idea of the analyst or the therapist as the subject supposed to know. That the patient has to think that we know something, or else it won't work. They won't respect us. They won't come to us. They won't seek out our help. But we have to know that it's a scam, in that, of course, we don't know. We're the subjects supposed to know. So that's number one, walking in with this idea of listening as a subject supposed to know, that the patient knows, not, and it's the unconscious that we're listening to. One other thing I want to say, just a difference in when you have an idea of what you think is wrong. In other words, when you think you know something, you're listening for that thing. And that's risky because of all that you might miss. So the other thing that I've learned from Lacan, one of the many things, but the orientation is listening to, not listening for. You're not listening for something, you're just listening to. And wherever it is that the unconscious presents itself, that's what you're listening to. But not that you have an idea going in.
Can you give an example? Like, what would be an example of that?
Well, just to stick with the same example that I gave earlier with the patient coming late and all the different cliched reasons that we can, because we've read books and we have knowledge, supposedly, right? Of why a patient might do that and what psychological pathology underlies that he can't just show up on time to the session. Um, and to suspend that and to help the patient say what it is for them, for that person. Really believing that we don't know, the idea that, there is this idea that you can be more helpful when you're working with someone outside of your own community because you don't have the assumption of knowledge. So you can ask better questions. So I think if you take that stance with every single person that you see, it's very, very hard because we also
It's
have to
hard.
present ourselves.
Hard to be humble, isn't it?
Well, it's hard because you both have to, give the sense of safety. The patient will feel safe if the patient thinks you are in the position of authority to help them. In other words, you have the knowledge, but then you also have to recognize that you don't have the knowledge. So it's that
Delicate balance.
dialectical
Yeah.
position. Yes.
Interesting. Fascinating. Okay. Any last comments or questions before we wrap up for the night? Okay. Nobody? Chaya, I want to thank you for doing this. This is part number 2. Part 1 was done a couple of years ago, and we, for some reason, cannot locate the recording, but I'm going to keep looking for it, and either we'll send it out together or I'll put it up on the YouTube channel. I'd love for all of you who can to subscribe to the Mondays with Moshe YouTube channel. And I really appreciate that you came on tonight. Chaya, both you and the participants, thank you very much for joining. We're going to log off now and call it a night. And for those of you who can,